Hello, everyone, and nice to be here, and thanks CGC for allowing us to talk. I'm actually representing my goal hat right now. I'm putting my goal hat on, and I want to say, obviously, I did not do this work on my own. It was a big participation from goal member community, as well as my two co-authors, Dr. Sanatna and Dr. Sampale. So what is GOAL? Well, the great thing is last year you guys learned about it from Dr. Jeremy Siegel. So GOAL is an organization for academic laboratories with a mission to help drive advancement in cutting-edge genomic testing. It facilitates interinstitutional cooperation as well as leveraging group resources and expertise to lower developmental barriers. There's further information about it, and if you are interested, there's a QR code, and I highly encourage people to look into this. The cool thing about GOAL is it started out with this whole mission, and I have to say thank you to Dara for really starting this whole organization on the idea of just building an NGS panel, essentially, and making it cheaper. And it really grew from that. It now has work groups and projects that I'm involved with, as well as Dr. Sanatna, and we have membership events, as well as publications are already out. So our group looked into the reporting practices of our GOAL member laboratories. If we're gonna have these panels that we design together, we should understand how our reporting practices vary amongst our institutions. So we set up a survey of 70 questions, sent it to the GOAL member laboratories, and we received 1 to 2 surveys per laboratory, which I'll talk about later. Basically, it was to gauge the use of software capability, variant classification, disease ontology, variant reporting, therapy and trial reporting, and research and data sharing. So the 1 to 2 laboratories. We had the original hypothesis that heme malignancy testing and solid tumor testing were going to vary significantly in terms of reporting. And so we offered to labs, if your heme testing group and your solid tumor testing group do vary, you can submit one survey for each. However, if you are essentially treating them the same, you can submit a single survey covering both. Now, to make our numbers correct, we had to basically double the responses for those single surveys and act like they were heme and solid tumor separately. So we ended up having 28 labs submit a total of 39 surveys. Interestingly, the first thing that we asked that we thought most labs would follow in line with is tiering variants. And obviously, most labs report tiering variants, but what they say is that the tiering criteria that they use is quite different, and even in the same laboratory, they might use different criteria for tiering based on the report. And so what we gathered out of this is you can have these guidelines that are excellent, but people still have reasons to kind of go between guidelines, to choose pathogenic versus likely versus benign, to choose the AMP-ASCO method of tiering. The common databases used, I'm sure most of you know all of these databases. If you don't, you can write them down and check out for your own edification. Most labs do not use a data aggregator for tiering variants of this group. So germline testing. So most labs reported that they do not do germline testing. And of the small proportion that do, about half do it concurrently on all cases, and the other half reflex as needed. And this is one of the differences that we saw between the heme and solid tumor group, which makes a lot of sense, that heme did not have any in the concurrent germline testing. You know, you have a blood sample or a bone marrow sample for heme, and if you think there's something germline, you're supposed to test fibroblasts, culture fibroblasts, but a lot of labs also test like saliva samples or buccal swabs. But on the solid tumor side, you can usually find a piece of the tissue that was tumor normal. So when it comes to reporting potential germline variants, if the variant was pathogenic or likely pathogenic or oncogenic, most labs would make a comment about germline testing and counseling and or their inability to differentiate between somatic and germline variants based on their testing. But they would call it out. If it came to VUS, most treated like a somatic VUS and did not mention it all. Reporting copy number, a majority of the labs report copy number variants based off their NGS panels, with a majority of those reporting only pathogenic CNVs, so no VUSs. The number of copies were listed in most cases, and a lot of labs, which I think is very interesting as a cytogeneticist myself, did report regional gains and losses. So understanding that structural data, understanding what a loss of 17, chromosome 17 is versus an isolated loss of TP53. For the VUSs, all labs report VUSs, and most of them reported it all of the time and included all the VUSs. Most labs list pertinent negatives some or all of the time. And then most labs report below stated LOD. And the comments that we got we asked for comments on this one, and it was high confidence calls above background noise or threshold, additional confirmation such as ddPCR, or depends on the clinical situation. Example, tumor burden. I'm sure you guys have received lung cancer samples that are around 5%, and your 5% LOD might not cover that. So you might go below to look for that EGFR variant, for example. And what was noted that it was director discretion. So this is a great follow-up to the FDA talk. This obviously would not be passing their standards if reporting below LOD, but it was very much a clinical choice made by a clinically certified director. The results interpretation. This is where we start to get into the kind of nitty-gritty of what our job is as an academic lab. Many of the labs would report on negative reports that there are studies that this study might not be sufficient and optimal, and maybe list some other studies that might be pertinent to that type of tumor. Variant prognostic significance influenced by the presence of another variant. So as a person who specializes in heme, I think of like Waldenstrom's or LPL, where if you have an MYD88 and you have a CXCR4, that's a very different situation than an MYD88. So most labs would report them singly in their interpretation or in their results interpretations, but then they would put in a major interpretation, like a combined interpretation. They would talk about their joint meaning. And then challenging cases. Only a small percentage of our laboratories would say that in challenging cases they would just have a single director review. A majority of them communicated with their peers. So either had a consensus conference and agreed upon a result, or just talked to the director next door. Follow-up testing. So obviously this was another difference between solid tumor testing and heme malignancy testing. Follow-up testing was way more common in heme malignancy. That's because it's a clonal disease that you're tracking over time. Solid tumor, if you think about it, you're really not following up unless there's a metastasis and you want to know if it's de novo or if it's because of the original primary tumor. What we found is that goal labs perform a significant amount of manual review. So specifying previous variants. We saw that NPM1 in the original diagnosis for AML. Now we have therapy and we want to see if that NPM1 is present, and it's not present, and we want to note what variants were in there on the previous test to note if we've followed them up. Low-level review for previous variants. So now we want to go back and look, did that NPM1 actually be present? Was it present at like 1% below our filtered review? And most labs reported doing that. Review of previous case for new variants. So now our patient is going through a clonal expansion and they may have gained an NRAS. Well, was that NRAS really new to this sample, or was it present in the previous sample but below review? So we would, most labs suggested that they would go back and look for that previous variant in the previous case. The interesting thing, obviously, is that follow-up LOD may be lower. That was noted by every lab, essentially. And most labs indicated that their EHR does not automatically track results. So this obviously takes a lot of time. This is a pressure point on most laboratorians. And then correlation with previous results is a helpful tool or feature of software packages. So we really encourage those that are developing software to think about how we can correlate previous results based on, say, an MRN or something. So therapy and clinical trials. Most labs report that they offer therapies on their reports. So, and when we asked further, they said that they do tailor their therapies to that patient. So, for example, some labs, if you had a patient that was 80 years old with a new AML, you might not suggest that they should go onto a therapy that would be a stem cell transplant. And so that's a lot of time and effort. When we asked about clinical trials, most labs say they do not report clinical trials. Sorry. And then what we asked is what was the clinician's preference? And remember that the clinicians are our clients in the end. While we are here to help patients, we do need to answer to our clinicians. And what was interesting is that most labs did not know if their clinicians wanted this information or not. And it was much greater that in the clinical trials case that they didn't want to know. And that was because they made notes of clinicians are making a decision and they don't want to have a clinical trial listed that their patient could potentially see and then come back to them and say, why wasn't I put on this clinical trial when the clinician didn't think it was appropriate? So that was, clinical trials were more known how the clinician would respond. Data sharing and research. Most labs are not routinely sharing variants and interpretations with a public or private database. And research extraction is considered somewhat difficult based on their software. And finally, conclusions. I talked about the differences between solid tumor and heme malignancy. What was interesting is we thought there'd be a major difference, and there really wasn't between the variant reporting. The significant amount of effort spent on cases and the challenges with implementing guidelines, maintaining the database, and also there's quite an interest in shared resources for clinical and research. Finally, I want to acknowledge the Goal Board of Directors, Tracy and Mel, for all their help, and everyone who took time to respond to the survey. So thank you.